Hello, everyone. I'm Regina Bain, the Executive Director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum. And today we are talking about joys and struggles in the life of a storyteller. I'm here with author, composer, musician, playwright, story listener, Pulitzer Prize and Tony winner, board member, founder, sister, daughter, cousin, and wellness practitioner, Quiara Hudes. Welcome, Quiara.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
Yes. So today we're talking about joys and struggles in the life of a storyteller. And to talk about that, I want to talk about both your life and the structures and institutions and experiences that have informed your life. But first, I want to start with the music. So you studied music at Yale as an undergrad. Your aunt was a composer with Big Apple Circus. You worked as a professional musician before you became a playwright. In the first of the Eliot plays, a trilogy you wrote, you talk about being inspired by a Bach fugue, then John Coltrane, and in the final piece, the traditional music of Puerto Rico. And when you did a talk last year that featured the story of Corey Menifee, you entered that story through music. So music is important. So what music are you listening to right now and why?
I listen to so much music on a daily basis. Lin-Manuel Miranda, who I wrote In the Heights with, he once, when we first met a long time ago and we started working together, we were driving up to Connecticut to go to the O'Neill Music Theater Center together. And he was going to DJ. I was driving and he plugged in my iPod and he looked at it and he was like, your taste is so kind of diverse as to be chaotic. He was like, your musical taste is chaos. I was like, yes. Okay. So right now, one of the things for research for a screenplay I'm writing, I've been listening to women musicians who were banned from Puerto Rican radio and TV in particular. I've learned a lot, and they were banned in the 60s and 70s. And so the listening has been kind of with a historical curiosity also. There's a long list of them, and it kind of shows the history of racism on Puerto Rican broadcast television. But two that I was listening to in particular this morning, one is Lucecita, whose full name is Lucecita Benitez. When she was a child, she was a musical star. She won international prizes for her voice, and she presented as very feminine. She's mixed race, so her father's a Black Puerto Rican, her mother's a white Puerto Rican, and she straightened her hair and did all this. And in the late 60s, she came to do a tour in the United States and met with a bunch of thought leaders and really became invested in the Black liberation movement. And it infected her style, it infected her music and lyrics, and she started singing about racial empowerment and awareness in her lyrics. She started wearing tuxedos and stopped straightening her hair and wore afros, and it was pretty bold. And for that, she went from being the pride of Puerto Rico to no TV for her. They told her to straighten her nose. They did successfully get her to cut off her hair. She describes it as a very traumatic moment in her life. And she's still around and kicking. She's still rocking it. So she's one of the people I was listening to this morning. Another one I won't go into as much detail is La Lupe, who is not Puerto Rican. She's a Cuban singer. And she presented as extremely self-empowered on stage. And they said she was banned for showing a little skin. They say she ripped her clothes off, but really if you look at on TV, but if you look at her performances, what she's showing is a woman who is assertive and self-reliant in terms of the sexuality she portrays. And I think there's something about that assertiveness that seems particularly threatening to some of the cultural standards of that time. So I've been listening to them, and the musicianship is off the charts, but they're also creating models for how to be, defiant female leaders and shift some needles there.
Yes, music as power, and power to use your voice in different ways to say what you need to say. And you're a musician, you're also a writer, and a writer in many different ways: screenwriting, playwriting, memoir. And you talk about writing as play. What does that mean for you? What does it mean to write as play? What does that feel like?
You know, you gotta like shake off the cobwebs. You gotta shake it up. I'm a fairly low energy person. And when I make new friends, there's always a moment where they see this side of me that's totally wild and that just busts out hysterically laughing or busts out dancing like I have no care in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, where did that come from? Okay, now I'm starting to understand a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the side I have to try to kind of tap into. The more meditative and philosophical energies, they come a little bit more naturally to me. So when I start my writing day, I put on music. I have a stand-up desk, so I put my desk up high so that I'm standing, so that my body can be feeling it. When I did this Corey Menefee speech, I try to bring that energy to not just writing, but to various things I do. So when I did this Corey Menefee speech at Yale, I asked the audience, let's all scream together.
I was totally going to ask us to do it at the top, but I backed away from it because I loved when you did that. It was amazing.
You know, and it's I didn't invent that. That came from a beautiful music ensemble in Philadelphia that did that once. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's amazing, because it's kind of scary at first, saying to a room of 100 or 200 people, we're all going to scream at the top of our lungs together. You think something bad's going to happen, but in fact, it's a release, and it's a little silly and embarrassing, and it also releases the frustration, and so it ignites this sense of play in people. I've never done it on Zoom, you know. I don't know if it's gonna like if it was back about college, but you know. So yeah, we got to play. We got to. Language is the tool I use mostly to play, and so I'm trying to be as creative as possible. I'm trying to break it in exciting and exhilarating ways. It's a tool that pretty much all of us have, language. So how do we take this old, worn, familiar thing and make it feel new? You know, that's my goal, and getting playful with it's very important in that.
So play is important, and joy is also important. And one of your joy practices is the Latinx casting manifesto with your sister, Gabriela Sanchez. So please share more about what that is and why it came to be.
Okay, so this is the Latinx casting manifesto was born when a conference came, and a theater conference, they asked me to do a keynote on theater and revolution. You know, and as I started to write it, I thought, well, am I really qualified to, you know, do I embody revolution? Have I really been doing the work to own that narrative and claim that narrative? And I immediately thought of my sister. She's 13 years younger than me. She's also a theater practitioner. She started a company in Philadelphia, which is where we're both from, called Power Street Theater Company. And they really do work in the community. They're based in the community. They engage and respond to community members in a way that's was very striking to me. I had been working in big regional institutional theaters for a long time at that point. And I thought her model is really different, and it's very real. And it's pulling off things that these multi-million-dollar budget organizations say they want to do in their language, but either aren't actually committed to or just have no idea how to pull off. And she was doing it on a shoestring budget and with tremendous success and authenticity. So I said, okay, let me ask my sister, let's talk about, you know, can you talk about theater and revolution with me? She said, yeah, I think we can talk about that. So we asked the conference, you know, can we give this speech together? And all of a sudden, as we were talking through our differences, you know, we're like this. She was my baby because she's 13 years younger than me, but we present very differently. She's darker skinned. You know, she's what we call voluptuous, which is, you know, how she says voluptuous, but she says it and spells it better. So, and she also speaks differently. She's got a little bit more of a North Philly thing happening in her speech patterns. And we have really different paths. And I was like, let's lean into this. What's this about? What's our different paths about? What's our different experience tell us? And it took off from there. We were like, we got to bring Abuela's Living Room to this national theater conference of theater academics. Let's do it. Mm-hmm. So it was everything from giving a glossary lesson. So voluptuous was one of our vocabulary words, voluptuous, but spelled better. What's another vocabulary word we had? We gave him a little vocabulary lesson that included yes, which she defined as the goddess in me lifts up the goddess in you. Mm-hmm. And that's something that informs our talks around the dinner table, but also our theater practice and our theater mm-hmm. ethics. Mm-hmm. From there, we started looking at, who are we casting and why? She is a producer. She owns this runs this theater company, but she's also an actor. And as a full-figured young woman, casting was an uphill battle in her life. So she was like, I got to make my own work so that I can do my work. So if you'll indulge me, I printed out this little chart here. I'm going to read from this chart.
Yes.
This is something that we talked about a lot, which is who are we casting? Okay. So I said, let me look at the numbers here, because to a certain extent, what I have found with life and with practicing art in particular is I'm not particularly interested in someone's politics. I'm interested in their actions. And so I'm like, okay, let's put this to the test. Who have I cast? When you're a playwright, you create roles. You are mm-hmm. creating jobs. What jobs am I creating? What am I actually putting into the marketplace or into the cultural conversation? So in my plays, I've created 67 roles in all my plays. 39 of those are Afro-Latino and or Latino roles. 12 of them are non-Latino African-American roles. I've got 3 Asian American roles, 1 Native American role, 3 Arab American roles. So I've started to look at the numbers. Mm-hmm. One of the ones I highlighted here was that 3 of them are body non-conforming roles. Now, and the roles that aren't designated, that doesn't mean those are necessarily white roles. A lot of those have been cast with diverse actors. It's just not designated in the script. And that doesn't even get into the movies. Now, something like my play, The Good Peaches, has been done once because it requires a symphony orchestra. So that's just 3 jobs. But when you look at something like Water by the Spoonful, something like In the Heights, those have been performed hundreds of times around the globe. So you're actually building the world when you're writing a play. And so, you have to create the change you want to see, as we all know. One of the things we found in our conversations is it's not enough for a producer or a playwright to just sit at the casting table and do the casting description. Okay, this role is, Ana is a full-figured Latina. She's a plus-size, righteous thigh Latina. Because of the way that mass culture works, it's going to start to get chipped away at. So you actually have to, if you're trying to do this sort of casting, you have to put it in the script, not just in the character description, in the language, in the lines of the script, so that you can say to your producing partners, your fellow artists, well, no, that doesn't work because look, it's actually in the script. So that would go against who we're looking at, to just help yourself stay on point. So that's some of the mix. That's some of the sancocho, which is another one of our vocab words. All the things we put in the stew of trying to make a more joyous, more respectful art practice.
Mm-hmm. And that practice sounds like it's been feeding your soul, but also the idea of thinking about specific numbers on top of that, both the intention and the outcome, I think is really important. You gave a talk, which was then shared as an essay called The High Tide of Heartbreak, in which you shared why you were taking a pause from playwriting. And you start that essay with love and wonder at the gift that is theater, and your experience with theater. And you talk about having paperback books that sit on a library shelf with your name on the cover that maybe a kid, you say like you, will discover for free and feel less lonely as she cracks open the pages. And then you go on to say, I fear that today, after all that, the wound feels bigger than I can handle. I fear that the ways theater has harmed me are winning out over the ways theater has nourished me. And then you talk about your experiences that you've had, and there are experiences and issues related to race, gender, language, socioeconomic status, respect. And you write, and I'm going to flow through your words, picking up some sentences and leaving others, so they're not in strict order, but you write, these structures and dynamics have hurt me. Like an onslaught of wolves, they come at me, biting, growling. They mock, especially my explorations of female wisdom, self-determination, and pleasure. I am starting to understand the hunch of Abuela's shoulders. I feel it in my heart. Today is my high tide of heartbreak. All tides, however, ebb. And yet there is relief that I can finally name it, or I'm finally willing to. Before revolution, honesty. That is my first step. So those were your words. So my question for you is about the second step. Mm-hmm. You wrote those words in 2018. What has been your journey since that high tide of heartbreak?
You know, it's hard to hear those words. It brings me right back to that crisis point in my creative life. It was personal, and it was hard. One of the things I found, one of the criticisms that has been lobbed at my writing throughout the years is that it's sentimental. And perhaps that's accurate sometimes, but because of its frequent flyer mile in my life, I really looked at it and I thought, there's something about the themes of women's love, of female wisdom, of pleasure and joy that are striking people, and in particular striking largely white critics as sentimental, that doesn't feel sentimental to me. What's the divergence there? And one of the things I started to realize was a divergence there is when you come from a lineage, a migratory lineage, so even on the island, my family was moving around for various reasons, because of natural disasters. Some of them went into underground hiding after participating in the nationalist movement and in some revolutionary movements there. Then they get to Philadelphia, and there's further migration because of gentrification. They get pushed farther and farther to the city limits. And there's not a lot of a paper trail. You know, you can't walk into a library and say, I wonder, you know, what families like mine were doing, you know, in the 70s, and find it very easily. I have a very high level of research skill at this point, but for the layperson, that paper trail doesn't exist. And so the need for storytelling that asserts presence, love, self-definition, it's urgent. It's not just about joy. In fact, you know, when we're dancing joyously, we're dancing for our lives and for ourselves, but we're also dancing against historical erasure. We're dancing against residential segregation that we faced. And so I feel like there was this whole written narrative that our joy is asserting itself in face of, that wasn't translating to some of the critics. Now that's a tangent. I kind of went off on a tangent there, but because your question was, how have I been since then? You know, anecdotally, a few things that it mentions in that essay are experiences I had where it's hard for largely Latino actors to just play night after night after night to white audiences. And that was something that I had to learn firsthand. I wasn't prepared for that as a theater artist. You hear things, that I mentioned this time at intermission when I was at a wonderful theater working, and, a patron was demanding his money back because he doesn't come to the theater to hear Spicanese. This is one example I mentioned. There's numbers of them. And if I'm hearing it, the actors are getting that vibe strongly up there on stage. So since then, I took a little pause, and I needed to center myself again and think about audience and think about positioning myself. I've been working in film. I've been writing some screenplays. I wrote a memoir, and I've been good. I needed that break, but I also feel I'm ready to come back. I want to come back. Theater had lifted me and held me, and I owe it a debt for that. I can't just abandon ship and pretend like it doesn't exist in my life anymore. That would be very turncoat of me, So I have to figure out how to return to theater with some of the clout I've gained over the years, and try to push that needle as best I can.
So one of the ways I think you may be doing that is through We See You White American Theater. And this is a Black, Indigenous, and people of color collective, and that has had some action connected to it. So what is We See You White American Theater, and how did it come to be?
Well, it's a collective group action, and and it's centered on anonymity. Because they don't want it to become a cult of personality. It's about the message, the vibe, the work, not the people behind it and whether or not you like them or like their plays or whatever of that. And some of the demands are so basic. For instance, land acknowledgement, right? So theater is made of physical space. I could argue with some of my theater colleagues who are very pro Zoom theater. For me, it's fine. It's a stopgap, and it has led to wonderful creativity. But for me, theater is at its essence about shared space, and that's what distinguishes it from other art forms. And so where are our bodies in space? Well, right now I'm coming at you from Washington Heights, New York, AKA unceded Munsee Lenape land, territory. And what would it mean for plays to acknowledge to audiences and to each other what land they're inhabiting at that moment? The history of taking up space. And, it seems unrelated to these kind of experiences I had at intermission that led me to step aside from theater. But it's not unrelated. I remember this other time I was at the Goodman Theater in Chicago, which I love. I love the Goodman Theater very much. But an audience member at the talkback at the end, he stood up, he said, "I love the play, but why on earth do they have to be Puerto Rican? This is everyone's story." This was very early in my career, and I just had this kind of uh-oh moment in my gut. I said, oh no. It seems so naive of me now, but I didn't realize. I was like, this is creating an issue for people, just the fact of having Boricua bodies on stage. So I do think even these basic demands of land acknowledgement, we're talking about what space do we inhabit? Who has the right to be on these spaces? I like talking about the basics. I feel like the basics get brushed past very quickly in society. So that's one of the demands that we're talking about. But there's a huge long list, and it's extremely ambitious. It's wildly ambitious. It has ruffled many feathers, but I think it's doable, and I think it creates a more dynamic and challenging art form, which would be wonderful.
And that list of demands is 29 pages long, and it is basically a manual for cultural leaders for how to build a culturally competent institution. And so just to go through some of the categories of those demands, it includes cultural competency. And examples, we demand that institutional leaders seek out those who are different from themselves and value their differences. And something very specific, We demand costume shops be given proper training in styling and consultation of Black hair and makeup when working with Black actors. Alternatively, take the time to hire knowledgeable technicians. So both broad and specific. So that was under two examples under the category cultural competency. There's also the category of working conditions and hiring practices, artistic and curatorial practices, transparency, compensation, accountability, and boards, funding and resources for BIPOC theater organizations, commercial theater and Broadway, unions, press, academic and professional training programs. So it is extensive. And there is a recent report that is about outcomes, and it lists more than 100 institutions that have made headway and made action. So we see you as primarily about theater, but other cultural institutions, including museums, dance organizations, and more are having these same issues. So what do you think other cultural institutions can learn from what is happening in theater, and perhaps vice versa? What might theater learn from them?
You know, it is a blueprint for life, I tell you. And I didn't write these, you know, that I'm one pixel on a large screen in this. I'm very small, so I don't want to take credit. I don't want to take any credit here. I am a big supporter. I don't want to say much more about behind the scenes than that, but you know, I'm studying these and I'm learning from these. And the truth is, for far too long, there has been a real gulf, a real canyon divide between talking points and action. And I find, you know, I'm very blessed to have had a level of success in my art practice. I find even at the highest echelons, getting people to make this shift from, I work with people who talk beautifully, getting that to turn into action is tremendously difficult. It takes a lot of social savvy. It takes a lot of strategy, and I'm still learning how to do it, though it's a commitment to get not just myself, but my people on board. So I'm talking about film and TV, to say, okay, well, we're talking about that, but what happens when we do it? What happens when we do it? One, it costs money. People don't want to spend money, okay? Two, it's risky because you're putting yourself in the public line of fire. And people are scared. People don't want to risk their reputations. It's kind of easier to shift to the center. And so these questions about compensation are extremely important across the board. And I know it's very important in film and TV. You know, women are paid less. You know, there's such poor parity. And one thing I have found about, for instance, pay parity and pay scales is it's not just that people with equal qualifications are paid different amounts of money. It's that there are entire categories of people who just don't have the roles and the breadth of job positionings to get to the level. So it really has to be across the board. It's about the person starting out at 16 years old, the person starting out at 50 years old. And it costs money. It costs money to look for people. It costs money to invite communities in. It costs money to go out into communities, and people are afraid to go out into places they're not familiar with. So all of the above, all of the above.
So there's a lot of work being done to help institutions grow, but there are institutions that are doing it well, and that are helping to feed the soul. And so what are those institutions and gatherings, circles that are feeding the soul of Latinx theater and arts right now?
These organizations have been around. There's so much amazing small scale work being done. You know, I have found that the community organizations do not struggle with this. They know, they got the goods. Mm-hmm. It's the mid and large scale organizations that somehow become alienated from oftentimes the cities that they serve. You know, so I think of my sister's theater company as a very high benchmark for me. Their ethics in terms of how they cast. This is Power Street Theater in Philadelphia. their ethics in terms of how they invite audiences in. They don't just say, oh, well, I put up a poster in that neighborhood and they didn't come, so they're not interested in theater. No, first of all, they're in that neighborhood. They're finding out the spaces that are most welcoming and inviting to people in that neighborhood. They live in that neighborhood, okay? So the level of investment's real. And you can feel that walking into a lobby. They got ensemble members babysitting kids in the room next door so that the working parents can go watch the film. Or go watch the play, excuse me. In New York, I think of Marta Moreno Vega, who started a center here in Harlem for the Caribbean African diaspora. She has now opened a gallery in Lares, Puerto Rico, that I love tuning into, because they bring in these new Boricua artists that I'm not exposed to. And it's just, my visual palette expands every time I check out their work. Mm-hmm. There's these kind of small scale and what I would call localized efforts that I think are leading the charge in terms of ethics, in terms of artistic excellence and innovation around the country. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. So we started this conversation with music, and part of one of your healing practices, which is with your sister. What are your other healing practices? What brings you wellness? What brings you wholeness?
So when I wrote High Tide of Heartbreak, which was, I was just really struggling, you know, as a woman, as a Latina playwright. I just felt like I had just finally gotten knocked down and couldn't quite get up. And I sent an email to every Latina artist I'd ever worked with or seen and had their email address. And I said, you know, I'm having this experience and wellness really matters to me. Am I alone, or are other people wanting to talk about wellness? Would this be a valuable conversation to have? And let me tell you, the
gates open.
Oh my gosh. First of all, it was during the Trump administration. And so I think the amount of stress that communities were dealing with, you know, there were families being separated at the border. It was just a very stressful political environment for a lot of the artists I was reaching out to, let alone the issues within our art practice. So the emails I got back were like, yes, now, when, I'll bring the food, I'll bring the wine, tell us what to do. I found this little space, and we started this thing called the Bru Healers, which was a combination of brujas and healers. So we're like the healing witches, healing ourselves. One of them brought literally like a Wicked Witch of the West hat and put it in the middle of our circle. Someone led a prayer, someone did a reading, someone did a throat meditation. We were sharing all the wellness strategies we could with each other. Mm-hmm. And then we started meeting once a season to just reconnect. This is not a salon. This is not professional networking. This is how can we just be well together and fill up the well a little bit. This is the first time I noticed the connection of the word well and well. Wow. Okay. That just hit me.
Language, the writer. Yes.
You know, like fill the well with be well. So that now COVID, we met once on Zoom during COVID. That was wonderful. A baby was born during this time in our circle. There have been a lot of highs and lows. And let me tell you, some of these women who have stuck around in their careers 30, 40 years, we owe them a debt of gratitude. It has not been easy. It has not been easy. If you see a Latina theater artist who is over, let's say 50, you know, bow down, because that is someone who has decided to stick with it through thick and thin. And I tell you, it has not been easy. I tell you, they have seen, you know, they've been sitting in the casting hall time and again throughout their life to read for, you know, drug dealer number 1 or drug dealer number 2 or whatever. And so that creating circles, creating communities is a really big joy practice for me. It has been an absolute delight to share wellness and tears too with these artists.
Mm-hmm. So we're coming towards the end, and I want to talk about your memoir. So I work with the Louis Armstrong House Museum, and it's a house, but it's also archives. He was a musician who archived himself and felt that was important. And what we're trying to do is think about how contemporary artists can archive themselves so that they can tell their own stories. And memoir is an amazing way to do that. So can you talk about the memoir that you have written, why you wrote it, and what are some of the stories that you tell?
Yes, it's look, I have a copy right here. It's called My Broken Language. This is the British cover. I don't think I have the US copy here. My mom ran off with it, but it's about how I found myself in many different languages growing up. I am half Puerto Rican, half white Jewish. Eventually I was raised, after my parents separated, I was raised with my mom and my stepfather, who are both Puerto Rican, but it gave me a real window, so I was raised with, for one thing, two different kinds of English, okay, because of the cultural differences. I was raised with Spanish. I was raised with Spanglish. As a musician, I was raised with many different musical languages. So we're talking from Bach to Coltrane, to rock and roll, from Etta James to Bob Marley. My musical education had a lot of breadth to it. My mother was a santera, so my spiritual languages became richer and richer as I, in my teens, began to study my spiritual inheritances. So as a santera, my mom had these beautiful altars that she made from hand in our home that were like a visual art language unto themselves. I also would go to the Philadelphia Art Museum every Sunday and study the installation art there. So how do you build a language out of too much language, out of too many things? How do you build a self? Or is it just, we think of these things as fractured, but I didn't want to be just fractured. I want to be put together and full and replete. And so by the end of the memoir, I have found a way to use and engage really all these different languages that I struggled with, mastered, became fluent in. I find a way to use them in my own singular way, to tell a story in my own singular way.
So I'm going back to how I described you when I announced you, and you talk about the different languages and trying to fit them all into something that makes sense for who you are. And for me, this makes sense for who I've heard you to be in this conversation. I'm here with author, composer, musician, playwright, story listener, Pulitzer Prize and Tony winner, board member, founder, sister, daughter, cousin, and wellness practitioner, Quiara Hudes. Yes! And we can be all of that. And it's so amazing to see that in you, to see that example of wholeness and fullness and letting go and coming back to within your art and within your person. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. As we close, because we talked about action, are there any calls to action that you want to put forward to this community, things that they can do under the banner of the joys and struggles of the life of a storyteller?
Let's see. I think in terms of the action component, you have skills that can be put to use. Everyone does. Everyone does not have the same skills. So you have to find how your little slice of skills can be put to use in person through action, not just through speech. The action component has to go hand in hand with it. And I also think of a piece of advice my mom gave me that changed my life forever, which is, you are not to walk anyone's path but your own. That's your task.
Beautiful. So thank you so much. And I'm gonna give those who are watching some additional tasks. One, read Quiara's essay, High Tide of Heartbreak, important. Read and explore the We See You White America Theater website. And especially if you are a cultural leader and a cultural theater goer, that's important. Check out Quiara's memoir. And then two final pieces. One is both are about artists. So artists right now many are hurting because of our economy. And so as a point of action, consider giving to the Cultural Solidarity Fund, which goes directly to artists, and other funds like that, that are making sure that artists are whole in a very specific way with food on their table. So with that, this has been Impact. I'm Regina Bain, Executive Director of the Louis Armstrong House Museum. I've been here with Quiara Hudes. Have a glorious day.